This is a full recap of Day 17 in the Lindsay Clancy trial, and it was a short one. The day ended as soon as it began. Let's get into it. The morning got off to a very early start outside Plymouth Superior Court, where more than 100 women dressed in pink gathered for a silent demonstration officially called Stand in Peace. They were there to show their support for Lindsay Clancy while also calling for a more open conversation about women's mental health and meaningful reform in maternal and postpartum mental health care. Court did not get underway until shortly after 10 this morning. Before testimony began, the attorneys met with Judge Sullivan at sidebar. The jurors were then brought into the courtroom individually, in the order in which they are seated, and questioned under oath. The court did not publicly explain why the jurors were being questioned. Judge Sullivan only told them that today would be a short day because of an issue that had nothing to do with either of the attorneys. He again told the jurors not to speculate about the issue or hold it against either side. Then the defense called Sheila Cavanagh. Cavanagh is a board-certified chaplain at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I did not know that there was such a thing as a board-certified chaplain, but the process is actually pretty extensive. It requires at least a master's degree in theology or divinity, 1,600 hours of additional training, another 2,000 hours of clinical experience, and mastery of 30 different competencies before a national board. Before becoming a chaplain, Cavanagh spent 16 years as a senior vice president at Fidelity Investments. She has now worked at Brigham and Women's Hospital for 7 years. Cavanagh first met Lindsay on the morning of January 25, 2023, the day after the children died. She described making her way through what she called concentric circles of law enforcement before she could reach Lindsay's hospital room. At that point, Lindsay could not speak. Cavanagh described her as being dressed in what looked like medical armor. She was intubated, wearing a neck brace and covered in tubes, bandages, and medical equipment. Cavanagh returned the following day, but Lindsay was still intubated. The first time they were able to speak was January 31st, after Lindsay's breathing tube had been removed. Cavanagh described Lindsay's emotional state as neutral and said she had a flat affect. And as Cavanagh held her hand, Lindsay reportedly said, "I am so glad my children are safe." Cavanagh said she responded theologically. She told Lindsay that her children were safe in heaven with God, and then she held her hand while they prayed for them. She testified that Lindsay also talked about hearing a voice. According to Cavanagh, Lindsay said the voice told her that if she did not follow its command, neither she nor her children would be safe. She described the voice as male and persistent. Cavanagh said the subject of the voice came up several times during several of their visits. She visited Lindsay at least 14 times while Lindsay was hospitalized at Brigham and Women's. She then continued visiting her after Lindsay was transferred to Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital. Once Lindsay was moved to Tewksbury State Hospital, Cavanagh continued seeing her on a weekly basis, and by her estimate, she has now visited Lindsay approximately 200 times, with the most recent visit taking place shortly before this trial began. She testified that Lindsay speaks frequently about her children, loves them deeply, and continues to carry immense grief over their deaths. On cross-examination, the prosecution focused heavily on Cavanagh's written notes. Cavanagh documented her visits with Lindsay in the Brigham and Women's medical records, but she never documented Lindsay saying that she heard a voice. She also never documented the alleged command or that the voice was male and persistent, despite testifying that the subject came up several times. Prosecutor Sprague then walked her through some of the details she did include. On February 6th, Cavanagh wrote that Lindsay was afraid she might never be able to walk again and feared that her paralysis could make her vulnerable to other people in the future. On February 9th, she described Lindsay as more visibly engaged, energized, and hopeful than she had appeared during previous visits. On February 13th, she wrote that Lindsay felt she had gained considerable physical strength and agility, despite still being unable to move her legs. Then on February 16th, she described Lindsay as hopeful and uplifted about her anticipated transfer to Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital. She also documented Lindsay quietly playing cards with her mother. Sprague's point was that Cavanagh's notes included specific details about Lindsay's fears, feelings, physical progress, and even some of the things Lindsay said, but there was nothing about the voice. Cavanagh explained that a chaplain's notes are not intended to be a verbatim transcript of everything a patient says. She said she was not there to evaluate Lindsay medically. Her role was to bear witness to her suffering. On redirect, Reddington asked Cavanagh to explain the confidential relationship between a chaplain and a patient. Cavanagh said chaplains approach patients inside what she called a, quote, vortex of trust. Some hospital chaplains are ordained members of the clergy, so there is an understanding that personal conversations with patients are confidential. Those conversations are different from a chaplain documenting their own observations about a patient's appearance or emotional state. For example, when Cavanagh wrote that Lindsay appeared, quote, uplifted, that was her observation. Lindsay did not necessarily tell her, "I feel uplifted." But on recross, Sprague pointed out that Cavanagh did sometimes include Lindsay's actual words. In the February 6th note, Cavanagh placed Lindsay's fear of, quote, not being able to walk again in quotation marks. Cavanagh clarified that she was not prohibited from recording a patient's words. She uses her best judgment when deciding what belongs in the medical record and what should remain part of a confidential conversation. The complete absence of the voice from her notes is something the prosecution can argue as an evidentiary weakness, but Cavanagh did offer an explanation for that omission. Her position was that she was serving as Lindsay's chaplain, not evaluating her as a psychiatrist or documenting every confidential spiritual conversation they had. After the jury was dismissed, the court held a brief preliminary conference about jury instructions. The biggest dispute was over whether the jury should be instructed on involuntary intoxication. The Commonwealth argued that there isn't enough evidence to support it, while the defense argued the effects of Lindsay's prescribed medications, including changes and withdrawal, make that instruction necessary. Reddington also asked the judge to consider involuntary manslaughter as a lesser offense. The judge will give both sides a rough draft of the jury instructions tomorrow, and closings are tentatively expected Monday or Tuesday. The jury is expected to return tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for a much lengthier court day, at least that's what the judge keeps saying, and the defense is expected to rest its case by end of week. So make sure that you like, comment, share, subscribe so you can continue to receive these updates, and I'll catch you in the next one.